And here I would like to kind of just show some of the links that madrasas have to mainstream schools. Again, it's good to see that about 24% of these schools had some sort of links with mainstream schools, although the purpose of that kind of differed, and I'll talk over that in a minute. So there was an added advantage when these kind of madrasas reach out to the mainstream schools, whether it's, as you can see from the graph below, whether it's to discuss kind of progress of individual pupils. And this was absolutely crucial for particularly children with special needs, so that there was some kind of form of communication channel between the two institutions, that the child doesn't kind of feel left out in the madrasa's context and kind of not understood and all that. The second highest kind of reason, or the most important reason for those linkages to take place were kind of more practical. So, whether to publicize the kind of the classes to young kids or parents, or to make sure that they're not arranging exams at around the same time, so they're not clashing, etc. And of course, the other practical reason was to use the facilities in mainstream schools. And I think this is important, not just in terms of building those bridges, but it's important in terms of providing some form of continuity for the child, so that they're not kind of moving from a well-established building or institution to kind of the back of like a small building, not very well lit and all that. So I think having the madrasa's teacher kind of come to the mainstream school after they finish classes makes a whole difference for the children, so that they're not kind of, it's an extracurricular activity, and they're not feeling kind of left out when other students are kind of doing art or other things. It's just another extracurricular activity that doesn't necessarily conflict with what they're doing during the day. Now, madrasas were also perceived to provide children with improved social skills and confidence. This is often was reflected in some of the current students' kind of statements. But they were also perceived to use excessively strict approaches to discipline, and their narrow teaching content was seen to limit their positive influence on children. So again, if some of the teaching methods were a bit archaic, and it's very difficult to get the child to engage fully. And but in general, whether it was kind of current or past students, these institutions were seen as centers for instilling discipline and sense of duty in Muslim children. The majority also of former madrasa pupils stated that attending madrasas felt that the strict environment and religious context that kind of influenced the rest of their life, really, and so in terms of controlling their behavior, etc. Others also felt that it instilled a sense of spiritual fear, however, that kind of disappeared once they went back to the mainstream school. So it was kind of, strong sense of fear in the madrasas, and then they kind of go wild after they go to the mainstream school. And then others also felt that the sort of strict discipline methods, etc., really left marks on their sort of identity, and also affected their welfare. their children. And this is a more kind of serious issue. So there were a few mentions of use of corporal punishment in the research. Not a lot, but I think a couple. Still, that shouldn't be ignored. And this is sort of perpetuated because of the gap in the regulation, which doesn't necessarily impose the kind of criminal record bureau, so CRB checks, excuse me, on all staffs in madrasas. So basically, 1 in 10 of the madrasas who responded to our survey confirmed that they didn't have a CRB check. And this is quite substantial. If we estimate that there are about 2,000 madrasas, if you go for 1%, that's still quite a significant percentage. So it's not, so the other surprising fact was that corporal punishment is not explicitly banned in law within supplementary schools. So, and madrasa stars are able to use reasonable punishment as a legal defense for any physical action against children. So, so these issues around corporal punishment were covered in a report that was commissioned by the government called the Singleton Report, and which recommended towards the end, the law to be changed in this area. So although the previous Labour government accepted its recommendations, the current government still hasn't implemented them. So this is really kind of urgent sort of area for change. We did come across a number of positive kind of cases in terms of good practice. So many councils, for instance, and community organizations are training madrasa representatives on child protection issues and have produced guidelines. So for instance, Kirklees Council produced a document called Safe Children, Sound Learning Guidance for Madrasas. Other initiatives like in Leicester, between the Council and the Federation of Muslim Organizations also integrated about 65 Muslim supplementary schools and provided them with training and resources in terms of safeguarding standards. Now, very briefly, and some of these recommendations around educational and development and child welfare are very obvious. So I think the first one is really to encourage local authorities to use their contacts with madrasas to help them to build bridges between madrasas and mainstream schools, but also to kind of play a role of a brokerage to foster relationships and partnership working. Naturally, all supplementary schools, including faith ones, should be required to have CRB checks, and all their staff, in order to fully meet the legal obligations. The current ban on physical punishment in schools and other children's settings should be extended to include supplementary schools, including madrasas. Now, more specific recommendations we did put forward, and so, for instance, madrasa staff should be trained on how to effectively implement policies. I think a number of them have those policies, but they don't know exactly what they mean and how to translate them into practice. So, for instance, we think that the Mosque and Imams National Advisory Board, MINAB, and the National Resource Center could play a role in this process. And finally, local authorities can learn from the good practices that's happening in a number of areas, where training is encouraged through local supplementary schools and consortiums. So again, MINAB and FMO should help to engage with the less formal types of madrasas that are neither registered no part of consortium. So these are the ones that are really left out and need a lot of kind of outreach work to be able to get to them. Oops, forgot these more. No, I think, yes. So now I'm moving to the second kind of aspect of the research, which focused on the identity development and community cohesion. So the findings around this are a little bit less, I suppose, definite in terms of numbers and all that, because they're of a qualitative nature. So they're so madrasas can be seen, as we know, potentially positive or influencing, kind of being of a positive influence on children and so British society, and can offer them vehicle through which stronger community relationships can be developed. But this obviously depends on a number of factors, and most importantly, it depends on the teachers, as mentioned earlier, teaching methods, content of teaching, and content of teaching. So madrasas can also reinforce the cultural and linguistic and as well as religious identities of pupils, which is again natural. This is the initial aims of the initial aim of most of the madrasas when they're set up. They can this is really has been supported in our research by the fact that 70% of those included in our research focus on the values and culture of Islam. And then madrasas also can provide children with a deeper understanding of Islam that's strengthening their religious identity. In many cases, this deeper knowledge and understanding can also give children confidence in explaining their religious practices and beliefs to non-Muslims. So instead of kind of being left out in, or feeling kind of insecure about a lot of the questions they're asked about their Islamic identity, I think madrasas does equip them with the, if they are kind of using obviously the right approach, and they can equip them with that sort of the information that they can use, rather than kind of the children, sort of looking for that information from other sources that could be even more dangerous and in terms of say radicalization of so leaving that kind of vacuum or kind of is more dangerous than not. So madrasas can also have the potential to create and increase division between child's religious and British identity, and this is often the criticism that's put forward. So it's a kind of, these institutions contribute to split in the identity of the child, creates confusion because they're told things in madrasas that they're not told in the so there's kind of an inconsistency, a disconnect between the two identities, but others also argue that these institutions actually help in kind of reconciling between the two, rather than widen the gap between their kind of British and Muslim identities. So, for instance, when they see other kids who are of the same background, who are able to kind of balance their identities, they're less likely to feel isolated and feel that kind of sense of isolation. But it's, again, we keep on referring back to the teachers. They absolutely play a key role in this whole process. So the madrasa's teachers were often seen as the kind of the deal breakers when it comes to this. So when you have a teacher who's born and brought up and who's second generation and who's struggled with the same issues that these children are struggling with, it's much easier to relate and kind of be, you know, reach out to them. And but if you came to the country only a few months ago and you're not knowing the context, it's very difficult to understand what they're going through, and thus you present an image of how you're supposed to be a Muslim that's for a different context. You know, it's not the British context. So the non-UK born imams or teachers were often recognized as being less able to support children in understanding their dual sense of identity. So although madrasas have previously been described as places where children can be taught extremism or extremist values, our research identified an important role for madrasas in increasing children's understanding of their role as British citizens. And here, in fact, the government has even invested. So probably this is maybe one of the very few government-funded initiatives that directly targets madrasas. They funded a program or kind of piloting an Islam and citizenship education project. So what they've done is developed curriculum material for madrasas that use the British context and it's been piloted in 300 madrasas in the UK. So the curriculum is available online, but unfortunately, apart from those madrasas where it's been piloted, none of the other madrasas that we've surveyed knew about it. So again, it's kind of very strange to see how so much effort has gone into this, yet the dissemination hasn't been great enough to reach out to. Although it has to be said that others also felt that what they're teaching is already kind of aligned or communicating sort of the principles of good citizenship. So they didn't want to use the material that was kind of funded by the government because they thought there was no contradiction with the existing material they were using. Madrasas are often perceived by the media and policymakers as being disconnected and visible to the wider community in which they operate, and to some extent this is true because 90% of madrasas serve children from their kind of single local authority area, so they didn't reach out to other and sort of the wider community, and this is probably for practical reasons. If we think that in some areas there's such a high demand for madrasas because there's a large Muslim community, the majority will come from that area. They're not going to come from outside that area. Our research also identified a strong appetite within the Muslim community to use madrasas to develop stronger links with the wider community. So some mentioned sort of open days that they've been using, try and welcome in members of the community to see what they're doing, etc. It was also interesting to see that despite all the negative media coverage around madrasas, and especially when we were doing the research where there were a couple of very negative programs on British channels, some madrasas really were keen to talk to us about what they're doing because they thought that by doing this they're going to be able to dispel some of the myths around madrasas, and by keeping quiet they're just continuing that sort of negative debate around madrasas. So our research was not able to address the question of whether madrasas were actually radicalizing young British Muslims. participants were very critical about other aspects, but this didn't come up. Now, in terms of recommendations for these in this area, so again, MINAB is mentioned quite often here, but because this is the only sort of type of umbrella organization that has the potential to influence. So there might be new organizations, but so far when we did the research, this was the one that stood out. They could provide accredited training for madrasas teachers from overseas. So before they start teaching here, they should go through that and then get sort of, it's kind of part of their integration process in the UK. This process could enable these madrasas teachers to improve their ability to teach in the British context. Also improve their levels of English, as some of them don't speak much English, as well as help them understand the legal framework under which madrasas need to operate. National training and recruitment programs for imams should be implemented also through MINAB. There are already a number of institutions providing training for imams, including MINAB, but this could be expanded to encourage more British-born Muslims to become imams. And this is often seen as the best solution in terms of encouraging sort of more integration, that you need British-born imams as a way to tackle it. Madrasas should also strive to support the personal development of their pupils. So again, broadening the scope of the teaching, whether it's kind of to include history and kind of ethics and spirituality in the Islamic teaching, could help kind of move away from the more narrow focus on just the kind of recitation of Quran or the learning of Quran by heart, etc. Again, partnerships between madrasas and other supplementary schools could be beneficial and could provide a forum for knowledge sharing for the wider community to learn more about madrasas. The local schools can encourage this by providing madrasas with their kind of religious education classes alongside other local faith-based supplementary schools. I think if madrasas reach out to these other faith-based supplementary schools, again, it's another way of kind of showing that they're not too narrow in their approach and able to kind of build bridges with other faiths, etc. Joint initiatives should also be undertaken between faith institutions and community centres to strengthen relationships. And then finally, so to conclude, I mean, these are not really the final thoughts, but so madrasas have the potential, as we've seen from the findings of this research, to positively influence Muslim children's development, and as well as allow pupils to explore and understand their own identity and strengthen community cohesion. However, this is to a great extent held back by poor teaching standards and narrow curricula in many madrasas. The low visibility of madrasas in many communities creates a vacuum where myths replace proper evidence-based understanding of their role. And finally, madrasas can build bridges and support the learning and development of children, but it's highly dependent on the skills and approach of teachers as well as the content of teaching. Thank you very much.